I used to practice imagery when I played basketball. I used to practice making shots, and it's not particularly helpful if I'm just imagining myself missing all the time. Welcome to another episode of 80% Mental, everyone's favorite sports psychology podcast, probably. I'm Dr. Pete Olishaga. I'm here with Hugh Gilmore. Hugh, I've been listening to some other podcasts recently, and I think we need to get better at the chat at the start of the podcast. Have you got any ideas?
No.
Okay.
Is that my turn now to speak then? Okay, yeah, I do have an idea. No, I was thinking about this. I think the podcast is doing good, but if you want a podcast that has good chat on it, you should check out the No Lift Powerlifting podcast, where I first met today's guest. So I'm a little bit apprehensive about this episode, as per usual, maybe. I don't know. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. Was that a plug? Was that a plug for the No Lift podcast?
That was a plug for the No Lift podcast. It wasn't a very good plug. I'll have to try better later. No Lift Powerlifting podcast with Arthur Lynch. But yeah, we've got a brilliant guest on today who actually I'm a little bit scared about interviewing, because every time I've met him on Arthur's podcast, I've always felt outgunned by his intellectual knowledge of sports psychology and the ability to just recite coherent arguments that I don't understand because they're so much above my level of intellect. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting day today.
We're going to introduce our guest in a minute, but we want to get to the question that we're going to ask today. So as usual, we're here to answer a question about sports psychology. And this week's question is what you see really what you get? Now, I think that needs a little bit more context. So what we're going to be talking about this week is imagery, mental rehearsal, visualization. And we're going to get into those specific terms in a moment, because actually, they don't necessarily all mean the same thing. But what we're basically asking on today's episode is, can I use the power of the mind to imagine success? Does imagining success actually lead to success? And to help us out answering that question today, we've got a special guest, Dr. Owen McNeill. Hi, Owen. Welcome to 80% Mental.
Thanks a million, Pete. I'm going to have to correct you straight away. I'm not a doctor yet. I'll be submitting my PhD at the end of this month. So close, but no cigar at the minute. But thanks a million for having me on. I really appreciate it. Ever since Hugh told me about the project that you were putting together, I was very excited to come on. So I'm really looking forward to the chat.
Well, welcome to the show, and congratulations on your honorary doctorate that I've just given you.
That's great.
It's written here in front of me as well. It's got Owen's a PhD researcher. So Owen's a PhD researcher at the University of Limerick, examining the effect of motor stimulation interventions in sensory motor tasks. Owen, I just wonder if you could give us a little bit of an explanation, because I know a lot of our listeners aren't necessarily psychologists. Can you just explain what your PhD is about?
Yeah, no problem. So it's motor simulation interventions like motor imagery and action observation. And more specifically, it's actually the combined effect of action observation and motor imagery together as an intervention to see how that can kind of augment or affect or enhance performance in sensory motor skills. So we actually use golf putting as our kind of exemplar sensory motor skill. So I'm sure we'll talk a lot today about motor imagery or mental imagery, or we can get into the different terms. But there has been a kind of concerted move in the last 5 years, or a concerted shift, certainly in some of the applied research, into examining both observation, so like watching somebody perform a movement, and combining that with imagery to kind of enhance different types of motor skills, or to enhance performance in these different types of kind of sensory motor skills. So that's kind of what we're looking at, or what I have looked at.
Okay, so what you're telling us is that you're literally the perfect guest to have on to answer this question.
Well, we'll see.
Well, just kind of following up on what you just said, we'll get straight in with that first question. And that is, I mentioned the terms imagery and mental rehearsal and visualization, and you mentioned a couple of terms there as well. Before we get into it, it is quite important to get a handle on what some of those things mean, because they do get lumped together quite often. What's the difference?
So I think it's a pretty pertinent question, because there certainly has been a lack of clarity around some of these terms. When I think about mental rehearsal, I think about it as an umbrella term that can include imagery, certainly, but can also include things like self-talk, or attentional control, or even arousal control. So that's kind of what I would consider to be kind of mental rehearsal. You also hear visualization as used as a term, and I think it's a term that's used maybe more commonly in kind of mainstream media than in academia or in applied kind of psychology work. I think that the term visualization probably does kind of mental imagery or motor imagery a little bit of disservice, because it suggests that the process is visual in nature, when actually the process is like multi or polysensory in nature. When actually, if you're engaging in imagery in kind of an effective way or in a useful way, you're probably eliciting more than just one of the senses. So you're probably eliciting more than just the kind of the visual sense. The kind of the common terms would be mental imagery or motor imagery, where motor imagery would kind of refer to imagining the performance of a movement. And mental imagery probably refers to the more common or the more kind of general interpretation of imagery, where you might be imagining a scenario. That's my interpretation of those two terms. There still isn't like total clarity kind of in the literature, but generally motor imagery certainly would be considered like imagining performing a movement specifically.
So I suppose this is interesting, because like, while it's something that I've been taught as a sports psych that imagery is a good thing, the level of detail here you're going into, and what actually is imagery, and what is useful, what is not useful, and what the terms mean, is quite specific. So visualization is the visual image that you're seeing, but you don't use your eyes when you're using imagery, unless, of course, it's actually observation, where you're watching somebody perform a skill like you've just mentioned. And then you've mentioned polysensory or multisensory, where you might actually use multiple senses around your body or within your body to recreate that feeling or process of performing the skill. I suppose I'm always intrigued in that people say you've got 5 senses: sight, taste, smell, touch, sound. I think that's all 5, but that's actually a load of rubbish, because I think there's more than 27 senses whenever you take into account all the different proprioceptive features of the human body. So you're coming in here with a high level of science. I think that's a term. I don't know if that's a term or not, Pete, but Pete, Owen's got a high level of science here. Some of our listeners would be a bit like me and would have a low level of science. So if you were breaking it down to us low level science people, like, give me your one line on this.
One line on what term to use, or
yeah.
Just imagery is fine. It generally it kind of encompasses all the potential uses of the. It's funny. I'm slow to call it a technique, so we'll say all the potential use of the skill. Let's say that.
So if imagery is using all of the senses, not just visualizing, but using all of the senses to recreate an image, or to mentally prepare for training, competition, rehearsing a skill, something like that. Can you give me some examples of when an athlete might actually use imagery? What might they use it for?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Actually, we might get into the mechanisms in a little while, because that will kind of determine the context in which somebody actually uses imagery. So one scenario in which it can be extremely effective is in like a self-paced skill. So a skill where the performer has to initiate the action. So think something along the lines of a rugby place kick. Think about something like golf. Think about something like a pole vault, javelin, anything where the performer isn't necessarily reacting to some external stimuli. So as part of a pre-performance routine, that performer has the capacity to use motor imagery specifically, in a very kind of repeatable and in a very kind of conscious way. And so it can be particularly effective in that context, through kind of a primary mechanism where it's almost like an internal recreation of the task that's about to be performed, that we can talk about it in a little while. But then also it can help to push attentional focus towards a task relevant cue or towards something that's task relevant. So it can kind of aid attentional control or aid concentration in a moment that might be where there might potentially be distractions.
And Hugh, you work in weightlifting, and I wonder if you have any experience of using imagery with your athletes in training or in preparation for competition, because that sport seems to fit the description of a lot of what Owen was just talking about there.
Well, I always say to the athletes, in terms of this idea of a task-relevant cue, if you can rub your stomach and pat your head, that's actually quite a difficult thing. And I use that to elicit the point that maybe during a training session or during competition, they shouldn't focus more than on one cue. So that's where imagery comes in really useful. And another way to explain that to people is to imagine there's a wall in front of them and get them to move their pointer finger in their right hand in a clockwise direction, and then try with their big toe on their foot to draw a circle in a counterclockwise direction. And basically you can't do it. It's very difficult to do, but it just really sells the point of don't focus on more than one cue because your performance will degrade from an applied perspective. But I think also within like pre-performance routines, again, imagery is part, but not all of that process. I know Eddie Hall, somebody recently contacted me saying they heard that Eddie Hall, the world record deadlifter, I don't know if he's still the world record deadlifter, he imagines pulling a burning car off his family, which is quite intense. But I mean, he's deadlifting, an insane amount of weight, nearly up over 500 kilograms now, I think the world record is. So I suppose to point out that imagery is really useful in weightlifting, either whether it be a skill focus or an arousal focus for actually increasing the level of aggression within that. That would be my experience of using it.
And I wonder, because, you've talked about those self-paced skills, and Hugh, you just mentioned performance there as well. And I wonder, Owen, are there any other potential benefits other than, skill development or other than preparing for performance in the way that Hugh described? What are the other potential benefits to using imagery as an athlete?
Well, I know that Jennifer Cummings' group out of the University of Birmingham have done quite a lot of research into how imagery can augment self-efficacy specifically, and shows that people engaging with imagery interventions over time not only kind of enhance their performance, but enhance their self-efficacy around their performance as well. So I mean, there are certainly kind of multiple facets to the effect that imagery can have on athletes. That's not only like some sort of kind of direct performance enhancing mechanism. There does seem to be other associated benefits that can happen through imagery as well. Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about using imagery to improve task performance. You just mentioned self-efficacy there as well, which is just the kind of confidence that somebody might have to execute a specific skill at a specific time. I want to get into a little bit about how imagery actually works. And there's a number of different theoretical perspectives there, a number of different explanations. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I guess the most prominent kind of explanation or hypotheses that people are likely to have come across if they've done, a sports psychology master's or some sort of cognitive psychology module in an undergrad psychology course is the functional equivalence hypotheses. So it's probably popularized by Mark Janero in like 1997. So in one sentence, it essentially suggests that the underlying mechanisms or the underlying cognitive processes that are associated with imagery are the same as those that are associated with physical execution of the skill. So imagining the skill will share these cognitive processes, or actually, like in his 2001 paper, like he says that like simulated action states are the same, like their underlying processes are the same as those that are as like physical action states. I don't know how far into the weeds we want to get here, but it doesn't seem to be true that the underlying cognitive processes associated with imagery are identical to those that are associated with physical execution of a skill. So the way that it will be framed by Janero is that we have this action continuum where on one end of the continuum, you've got physical execution of an action. And on the other end of the continuum, you've got imagined action. All overt actions, so all physically executed actions, require a covert counterpart. So require imagery or some sort of a covert action process to occur. Whereas not all covert actions require an overt counterpart. That is, that we can perform imagery without physically executing that same action. And what General would really suggest is that these processes are extremely similar. So the cognitive processes required to perform, or that are kind of performed during imagery, are very similar to those that are performed during kind of physical execution. That explanation has been very prevalent in the literature for the last 25 or 30 years. And it goes some way to explain why we can elicit kind of psychophysiological responses that may be associated with physical execution of a task through imagery. Functional equivalence is still a very prevalent theory. It's still a very valuable theory, but imagery certainly isn't identical to physical execution on a neurologue. That makes sense, right?
You talked about this idea that for every physical action, there's almost like a mental blueprint or a mental representation of that action. And we can imagine an action without doing it, but we can't execute an action without imagining it. Is that right?
Yeah, essentially, without some sort of underlying cognitive kind of process being present.
So one of the examples that I often give in teaching this stuff is, when you see skiers at the top of the run and they're waiting to go down, and you can see them imagining the run and they're kind of flinching and twitching. What's going on there?
You have to ask the skier, maybe. So I'd imagine they're using imagery as like a planning technique to anticipate what they need to do, or to anticipate kind of what they're about to do. So in that sense, they are recreating internally what's about to happen in a kind of a physical capacity. I would imagine that's kind of what they're trying to do.
Imagery. I imagine an image and it's real. I imagine winning in my brain, and I feel real with imaginary.
Right. So, Pete, where are we going from here? Imagery, like, do coaches need to do this? Should they be teaching it?
I mean, look, in terms of kind of psychological skills or psychological interventions, imagery really at this point is probably one of the better supported tools that an athlete or a coach kind of has at their disposal. There's about 30 years of pretty high quality research now that shows that imagery can enhance performance across a number of different scenarios or in a number of different tasks. It obviously depends. It's not a panacea for it's not going to improve all performance in all capacities all the time. There are things that we need to consider, like individual differences, like people's imagery ability. In the context of like sports psychology research and the context of like well-supported interventions that can be used by athletes, imagery is certainly one of the ones that is kind of most well supported. And I'm not biased just because I've done some of that research.
We just talked about some of the evidence there, for using imagery and why people should maybe invest their time imagining a skill when they could be out just practicing it for real. But I'm kind of recalling some of the research here, and it seems that using imagery alongside physical practice is perhaps the most beneficial in terms of skill development, in terms of outcomes, rather than just using imagery. So it's not, like you said, it's not a panacea, it's not a replacement. We need to be doing this stuff alongside physical practice. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it should be seen as a pretty effective adjunct to physical practice. So the way it's often kind of framed, or the way it's often referred to, is that like, okay, there's a limit in terms of the amount of physical practice you can do on a kind of a given day or in a given session, and that you can supplement those repetitions or that physical practice with imagery to kind of further enhance some of those effects. And actually, there's been quite a few research papers that have shown that, like, even acutely, so even over like one bout of training, if you combine physical practice with imagery, that it tends to be more effective than either physical practice or imagery alone. So I think that's definitely a reasonable interpretation. I think that's definitely going to be the most effective method of applying imagery. It's going to be kind of alongside as an adjunct to physical practice rather than as some sort of replacement.
So the four guys in a bath in cool runnings, they're not allowed to have much track time. Track time's limited, so they're kind of supplementing that by sitting in a bath and imagining going down the the track.
I think it's a fantastic example. But yeah, so their physical practice time is limited, and it might be limited by track time, but it might be limited by physical capacities, right? I mean, if you take a golfer, like, it's pretty hard to hit like 500 balls a day or something like that, but it's pretty easy to hit 100 balls a day, and then to add in some mental practice to kind of enhance the effectiveness of that practice. So I think that's definitely a reasonable interpretation, that imagery will be most effective as an adjunct to physical practice. Yeah.
We're here with Owen McNeill, who I gave an honorary doctorate to at the start of the show, but he is a PhD researcher and an expert in all things imagery. If you're enjoying what you're hearing today, don't forget that you can tweet us at EPM Podcast, and you can find all of our episodes at www.80percentmental.com.
I'm pretty uncomfortable with the term expert in all things imagery.
It's all relative.
Well, it can be pretty. You can be pretty sure that I am not an expert in all things imagery. Owen, so imagery, like, it's all very well talking about it. We hear the words. I mean, I've even read papers and things like that about it. Obviously, I've been taught it to a degree, but like, how would you introduce this to somebody who's, say, a golfer, as you've mentioned? And then how would you know they're actually doing it and it's being successful?
Yeah, so I think that's I won't say the $1 million question, but I think that's the challenging question when it comes from the point of view of interpreting some of the research evidence and applying that, from a practitioner's kind of standpoint. So I think golf is a relatively straightforward one. So I do a lot of applied work in golf. And the application of imagery in that context is often immediately prior to a shot. Okay, so it's part of a pre-performance kind of routine, right? So there's three primary perspectives when you apply imagery. Okay, you can take an external perspective where you get somebody to imagine watching themselves perform the movement. You can take an internal perspective where you get people to imagine performing the movement and then the outcome of the movement through their own eyes. And then you've got a kinesthetic perspective where you get people to imagine what it feels like to perform the movement. So that's definitely something to consider, which perspective is going to be most effective for an individual athlete. And that's going to depend on the context of that athlete and on the context of the skill that they're trying to perform. But with golf, certainly internal visual perspective where they imagine the flight of the golf ball, and then a kinesthetic perspective where they imagine what it feels like to produce that flight on the golf ball, certainly tends to be quite effective for golf, like during a pre-performance routine. Something that I think is probably quite important is measuring the imagery ability of the athlete prior to giving them any kind of imagery intervention, because that will probably inform how you proceed with any imagery from a practical perspective. And the way that you would do that would generally be through possibly a self-report measure, so like the VMIQ or the MIQ, and then you can use like mental chronometry, so you can measure the difference between the time it takes for them to perform the imagined task versus the time it takes for them to perform the actual physical task, and that can be a decent indicator of somebody's imagery ability as well.
That's interesting, because you've mentioned about somebody's imagery ability, and I always like to use my favorite Rogers, or the famous psychologist Rogers. His favorite insight into applied psychology is you've got to know when to hold them, and you've got to know when to fold them. So, like, when would you not use imagery with somebody, or when is this contraindicated with an athlete?
Yeah, well, I mean, if somebody has like aphasia or something like that, where they actually can't create mental images, then then you obviously you might not use it in that context. So it's interesting. Imagery ability seems to be a skill that people can develop. That seems to be the case. So I know that Dan Eves and Jennifer Cumming have a nice review paper about this, but there's something called layered stimulus response training that seems to be pretty effective at enhancing somebody's imagery ability over time, where you basically boil any movement or any action down to like composite parts. So if you were trying to get someone to imagine hitting a golf putt, you would start with like the weight of the putter or how the putter feels in their hands, and just get them to imagine that for a couple of sessions before layering in more and more information about the actual movement or about the actual task. And that seems to be quite effective at developing imagery ability in people. In terms of when you kind of wouldn't use it, I think if people are having maybe pervasive negative imagery, that might be a scenario where you consider not using it. Now, because imagery is like, our imagination is such a central cognitive process to the human experience, it's pretty difficult to like nail down when not to use it. But if somebody was having like pervasive negative imagery, that might be a scenario where you wouldn't use it. Or alternatively, you could try to use it as like an if-then scenario, where it's like, okay, you're having this negative imagery, that's the worst case scenario. If that happens, then how would you respond? And maybe work that into the imagery. That's something that might be, that could potentially be useful.
Yeah. So I do have another tricky question for you, and it's kind of, it's where I feel imagery is often misused, especially outside of sports psych, because people talk about the term visualization, and you have to see it. If you can see it, then you can believe it, type thing. To the point where there was a story told by one of these people who is an advocate of Tony Robbins, and he had this guy from an Eastern European country, and basically the guy told a story about how he used to visualize, or he always had this image of being handed this trophy by a man in this building, and then 10 years later he's getting handed a trophy by a man, and that very man in this very building, for some of his community work in football. And the whole thing struck me as like post success attribution to some thing, like, I mean, trusting their interpretation of what they've previously imaged or whatever. I'm curious, like, and I don't know if you've heard of the book The Secret or any of that sort of stuff. It says like, if you imagine your success, it will come to you and all that stuff. How do we, I take it that's not imagery, and that's something we need to rip apart when people bring that idea of imagery, because there's going to be people listening to this who are not coaches and not sports psychs. What are your thoughts on that type of muck?
Yeah, so the so-called law of attraction, is it?
Yeah, that type of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complete misattribution. That's certainly not imagery. It's certainly not imagery in the academic or even in the kind of evidence-based sense of it, right? That's like a marketing tool, or it's like pseudo-scientific bullshit, if I'm allowed to curse. It's nonsense. I think with imagery, there should be a very specific. So if you're using motor imagery, you're imagining a specific movement, and then if you're using imagery in kind of a more generalized sense, you're imagining a very specific scenario that you might encounter, whether that's in a match, if it's in a training session, if it's in a rehabilitation session, rather than this kind of wishful thinking or this kind of law of attraction nonsense stuff, if that makes sense.
So, Owen, you talked about different skills or different contexts in which imagery might be useful, and that sort of determines the type of imagery that might be used. So depending on the skill, we might use imagery from an internal perspective, so we're imagining seeing it through our own eyes, or we might use an external perspective, almost as if we're watching ourselves on TV. Is the kind of exact the way I normally describe that.
Yeah, exactly,
I guess for somebody who's literally just started, somebody who's never done it before, what are tips that you might give for somebody to just, I don't know, if somebody's never done it, is there a quick sort of 30-second, 10-second exercise you could give them to introduce them to what imagery is? How do you use all of the senses?
Yeah, so I very simply, I think that you would pick as simple a skill or as simple a task as possible, and try to recreate that internally and elicit as many senses as you can during that recreation. That might only be for 10 seconds, or it might only be for 15 seconds. You wouldn't expect somebody at the very start, having never used imagery in a concentrated way before, to be able to recreate a full scene from a match, or a full scenario from a game or something like that. So I think keeping it very simple and keeping it very brief at the start is probably the best way to go. So I don't know if you were going to ask me about it, but the PETLEP model seems to be pretty well supported at this point in the context of the 7 proponents that it outlines are good goals to have in terms of when you're performing imagery. So matching the physical context, matching the environmental properties of the imagery, matching the timing, matching the task, your level of learning, and then choosing a suitable perspective. Those suggestions would seem to be pretty decent goals in terms of actually applying or performing imagery kind of on your own.
So perhaps start by, rather than starting by imagining yourself running a 100-meter race, maybe start by imagining putting your shoes on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Start small and start simple. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So with regards PETLEP, as I understand it, there's a degree of, putting your kit on nearly and, having the implement that you might use if you're a badminton player, you maybe hold a badminton racket, etc. Does that not move it out of the idea of imagery and into physical behavior matching, as you called it before?
Yeah, so it seems to be, so it is behavioral matching, but why wouldn't that be imagery? Why would imagery have to be the old school approach where you lie in the bed or sit in a really relaxing spot and imagine? That's probably not the most effective way of using imagery. If you're thinking about a golfer on the golf course, they're not sitting down on their golf bag and closing their eyes and imagining hitting the shot. They're in it, they're there standing behind the ball. It's still imagery. Caroline Wakefield has a really nice paper on this from 2012 about PETLEP as a behavioral matching kind of model rather than a functional equivalence model. If you have the goal of matching as many components as possible to the physical execution, what that does is, there may not be a direct neural mechanism that makes the imagery more effective by putting on your kit or by holding your badminton racket. But what it might do is make people more concentrated or more invested in the imagery process. And that actually might be what makes it helpful, or it might be what makes it kind of more effective than just lying there on the gym floor or sitting in some chair and kind of wistfully imagining performing a movement.
Yeah. So actually, if I get into my car and I'm learning to drive, I could do the imagery in the car, but it's not imagery.
Yeah.
As I start moving. As soon as I start moving, it's no longer imagery.
Well, as soon as you start moving the car, I hope you're not closing your eyes and using imagery. I hope you're actually physically performing the movement of controlling the car. Yeah.
Right. I need to go back to basics here. Eyes open when driving, eyes shut when doing imagery.
Maybe you can have eyes open when doing imagery as well, if that's your preference. Well, I'll give you an example, right? So you're a golfer. You're hitting a second shot into a par 4 to win a major. What's going to be more flow? You want to imagine the flight of the golf ball so in terms of the shot you're about to hit. I got my eyes open. The whole scene is in front of me. I can see the green. I can see the flag. I can imagine what the flight of the golf ball is in that context. All I have to do is create the flight of the golf ball. Or I can close my eyes, and now I have to create the scene that's in front of me and then also create the flight of the golf ball. So in that context, eyes open imagery might be potentially more effective. Again, it depends. Maybe somebody really doesn't want to see the crowd and maybe they want to actually close their eyes. That's also totally fine. And it also might have the capacity to be effective in that context.
Yeah. So I suppose in that scenario, it's imagine the outcome and then imagine you creating the outcome through the movement so that you're matching what you want. Is it, that seems quite new to me. Is that something if somebody went the other way, imagine creating the movement and then creating the outcome. Would you advise against that? Would you reverse engineer the imagery or not? What's the view here?
I think it would be down to personal preference, right? So in that scenario, somebody might be very focused on the kinesthetic element of the imagery. What does it feel like to hit the shot that I need to hit? And then imagine what the flight of the golf ball is. And actually, if you look at things like the VMIQ2 or the MIQ3 or the MIQR, like internal visual imagery, external visual imagery, and kinesthetic imagery are considered different skills or considered different abilities. So again, it depends on somebody's personal preference or their capacities in each of the different kind of perspectives as to which perspective is going to be most effective for them in that given scenario.
So the MIQs that you mentioned there are just mental imagery questionnaires, and you're talking about the skill of being able to imagine from that internal perspective, the skill of being able to imagine from that external perspective, and the skill of being able to feel the movements. You're saying they're all just different skills.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And are those different skills of imagery of internal, external versus feeling? Is there different sports where one variation is more appropriate than others? I've heard of stories of people who, race car drivers actually, not even being funny here, but actually going underneath the water in a swimming pool, sitting down there and then doing the imagery in a swimming pool at the bottom of a swimming pool while holding the breath, imagining going around a lap of a track. And, I just kind of think like that's obviously that driver's process and that's highly intense. But like, is he imagining the movements he's making? Is that better for him as a driver, or would he be better off imagining the movement of the car around the track and the tactics of it? Is it different for gymnastics or golf? Like, what's the story here?
I guess it's probably going to, certainly the task that's being performed is going to influence that. I also think individual differences, individual preferences, athlete to athlete, is also going to influence that as well. So I don't have a straight answer for you in terms of what's going to be like most effective. So you would imagine if you take somebody who wants to change a skill, right? So somebody who wants to change how they serve a tennis ball, or somebody who wants to change their golf swing or something like that, and they want to use imagery as an adjunct to their physical practice, then you would think that maybe some kind of external visual imagery would be effective in that context because they want to be able to see the changes. In that context, so that kind of third-person perspective might be very effective, where in the context of your race car driver, they might actually want to be in the perspective of like being in the car, seeing the world go by at 180 miles an hour, and while imagining the movements in response to the different corners or in response to the different kind of scenarios. That might be particularly effective in for race car driving. But again, I think it depends. I don't really have an answer for you there because I think it depends on the athlete. It depends on the context of the skill that's being performed as well. Sorry, it's a bit of a cop-out.
No, I think it depends is a perfectly reasonable answer. We've had that one plenty of times before, haven't we, here?
Yeah, we had Dave Collins on, and that's one of his favourite sayings is it depends, and then but also what it depends on.
So you're listening to the 80% Mental podcast with our guest today, Owen McNeill, an expert, because he doesn't like being called an expert, on imagery. And we've talked about a whole load of different things today. We've talked about what it is and how to perhaps do it. And the question I wanted to come to you with now, Owen, is what about when you just can't quite get it? If you're an athlete and you're trying imagery, but you're actually imagining things going wrong, and that can be from, just missing a shot to something quite serious, like imagining injuring yourself. What should we do there, maybe as an athlete or even as a sports psychologist who's working with an athlete who's unable to imagine positive outcomes?
Tough question. Good question. Why is imagining negative outcomes bad?
Well, it's not what I would want. If I'm imagining myself playing, because I used to do that. I used to practice imagery when I played basketball. I used to practice making shots, practice taking shots from different areas of the court. And it's not particularly helpful if I'm just imagining myself missing all the time. It's not necessarily going to boost my confidence. You talked about self-efficacy earlier on as a potential outcome. It's certainly not going to be helpful if I'm imagining myself getting injured. I'm going to perhaps be a little bit more tentative. I'm not going to be as confident going into contact if I've prepared and imagined playing in this game and I keep imagining myself, I don't know, landing and turning an ankle or something like that. So from that perspective, I guess it could potentially be a negative outcome.
No, I think I definitely agree with you there. I was just being devil's advocate for a second. It's an interesting one. If that were the case, it strikes, or it kind of suggests maybe a deeper reason or a deeper kind of mechanism for why those negative images are occurring, or for why that person is unable to create kind of the, I don't really like positive, like the kind of facilitative kind of imagery use for performance. So it'd probably be a case of maybe trying to drill down a little bit further and understand what the root cause of the debilitative kind of imagery, or you would imagine that there's probably some debilitative self-talk that might be occurring in that scenario also. And maybe using some like cognitive reframing techniques or something like that to actually deal with the root cause of why that person is struggling to perform the imagery in a facilitative kind of way. I mean, I know that using negative, in inverted commas, imagery as an if-then process, so if this happens, then how will I respond? I know there's been some research suggesting that might be an effective use of imagery. But I mean, in the scenario that you've outlined there, where it's clearly kind of a debilitative scenario, then I guess the hope would be that you'd be able to kind of drill down and understand why that's occurring, and then use some sort of restructuring or reframing technique to address that root cause, and then maybe try to slowly build more facilitative imagery into their kind of psychological preparation or their kind of psych skills kind of from there. I think that'd be kind of maybe a reasonable approach. I'd be interested, Pete, in your kind of interpretation of that, or be interested in terms of what you would think about that.
No, I completely agree. And I think it's an important thing for, again, any trainee psychs who might be listening to this, that, you know, it's not necessarily about the skill of, you know, imagery. It's not necessarily about how we're doing that, and curing, again, in inverted commas, negative images by just doing more and more and more imagery isn't necessarily the way to do it. Okay, well, you're not doing it right. We need to do it differently. We need to do it better. I absolutely agree. You know, it's potentially revealing of something underlying, whether it's a confidence issue or an anxiety issue or something else. And again, for any young psychs listening, it's about drilling down and really looking at all aspects of that athlete. Well, what else is going on? And as you say, let's kind of correct, I don't know if that's the right word, correct that image, breaking down that image. And there's all sorts of things we can do with timing and speed of it as well, and finding exactly where it is in that image that's going wrong, and pausing and rewinding, almost as if we're watching it on video. I mean, what do you either of you guys really, you know, what do you guys make of that idea of playing with the image to almost correct those debilitative images?
So I think that's potentially very useful. The caveat I would put in there is that requires quite a lot of imagery ability. That requires quite a lot of control of the image, the ability to kind of hold it in memory, or to kind of hold it in consciousness and transform it in that kind of context. Requires quite a lot of expertise, actually, in terms of the individual's imagery ability or their capacity to kind of change the image.
And presumably the psychologist as well, who's working with it.
Yeah. Yes, presumably, yeah. So I think that it's something that could be potentially very useful, but certainly with that caveat that not all people may be able to actually do that immediately, especially particularly if they're new to using imagery as like a psych skill as such.
It's interesting. I know within other therapy approaches, imagery is quite well used, and it's probably the first stage in flooding or exposure therapy is just imagining the phobia that you have. So I think it is useful to imagine things that do cause you anxiety, because that may cause you to acclimatize to that anxiety and normalize it, and then deal with that future scenario. So I suppose the context is heavily dependent there. Something I was going to throw at you is, and I've heard this from somebody who is an imagery person, another person who's researched imagery, but they made the comment that you shouldn't do imagery if you don't have skill acquisition, motor imagery, if you don't have the full range of motion in your joints. So say, for example, you've done an ankle like Pete's mentioned, and you haven't got your full range of motion, but then you're imagining making cuts and turns on the basketball court, that might actually not be the best thing for your skill acquisition in that. I'm curious if you've any thoughts on that, if that's an appropriate thing or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, to be honest. I know that healing imagery is something that's used a lot in kind of injury rehabilitation, or in kind of sometimes in stroke rehabilitation as well, alongside motor imagery. And when I say healing imagery, sometimes I get like weird faces back from students if I say it in class or something like that. But it's not like, using the law of attraction to knit your ligaments back together. It's not like a direct mechanism. It's that you get people to imagine having the range of motion, and that kind of motivates them, or that kind of supports them in their physical rehabilitation, which then actually allows them to return to a full range of motion. So I've definitely heard of imagery being used in that kind of context for injury rehabilitation. I haven't really come across that argument that that you shouldn't use it unless you have full range of motion in the joints, to be honest. But maybe that is an argument that's out there in the literature that I just haven't actually come across.
Well, if you're an expert on imagery, then tweet us at EPM Podcast. Let us know what you think. Interesting that we kind of veered off a little bit there into rehabilitation, injury rehabilitation. I was actually going to ask, this podcast is primarily about sport and sport performance, but imagery's got applications in other settings as well, in exercise settings, for example. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I mean, look, we've kind of talked about the use of imagery, about how it kind of goes beyond sport, right? So in the way that it's used in kind of therapeutic scenarios as well. So it is kind of a fundamental cognitive process, right? We think about it from a skill acquisition point of view a lot, or from a skill, or from like a performance point of view a lot, but it does go kind of far beyond that. I think if you look beyond some of the performance enhancing, or the potential performance enhancing benefits of using imagery, and you look more at the self-efficacy aspect, so the kind of the confidence kind of research, that's a usefulness that people can tap into when it comes to imagery, particularly around things like exercise, or perhaps around things like behavior change for people who are currently sedentary, or in scenarios like that. It certainly would have the capacity to have applications outside of just sports performance.
I think within that regard, one of the things that I find interesting is the use of imagery within law enforcement. And one of the research papers which I've read did a randomized control trial with one group who was given a task, which means they couldn't be doing any imagery. So they were fully occupied during the interlude, and they were trained before and after in a scenario where they had to discharge a weapon. And what they found is that the ones who did imagery before the test performed better significantly. But then on top of that, they also did a follow-up study where they imagined themselves being shot, and then how they would perform after being shot. And in the follow-up scenario, they were then shot with the paintball guns and had to still return fire to the target. And again, those who'd done imagery outperformed. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing, that imagery's been used in like other scenarios like that, but they're very much related to sport. But the thing that is curious is not just using imagery for positive performance, but actually using imagery for recovering from open an interactive performance, if you know what I mean. So I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on like how somebody would do that? Because I imagine like boxing, for example, everyone has a plan until they get hit. Is this the same with imagery, that you should be imagining, the setbacks and then incorporating that into your skill execution? Or what are your views on that?
Yeah, I think that's potentially a very useful method of applying imagery. So yeah, using it for these if-then scenarios. So I'll give you an example. This might be I'm I presume this is going to be mostly a UK audience, but so this might be a little bit of an inside baseball thing for myself and Hugh. But if you're playing a hurling match, Hugh, and you're marking somebody in a hurling match and a ball is hit into between you and your marker, there's two primary potential outcomes, right? Either you get the ball or your marker gets the ball. So you could potentially
That's not correct.
What's the other outcome?
You get the man.
Yeah, well, okay. But if we stick to the two primary outcomes that might be within the rules of the game, so you might have two different imagery scripts in that scenario. One where you imagine what you'll do if you get the ball out ahead of your man, and one where you imagine what you do if your man gets the ball ahead of you. So I think that is using imagery in that sense as if-then, for those if-then scenarios, could be a potentially very useful way of athletes using it as a preparatory kind of technique, actually. Yeah.
Owen, look, you've come on here and you've basically straightened me out in terms of imagery and the terms. Not only that, like I've taken away the idea of imagery for kinesthetic purposes and as well as internal versus external imagery. The idea that we need to make sure that we're using this with people who have imagery ability. And if you're training sports psych, there's obviously questionnaires out there to measure that. There's still a lot of work to be done within imagery and how that would be applied within sports psych. And, hopefully we'll maybe have you on again in the future in another episode. But I'd like to thank you very much. And as with Pete, for coming on to the 80% Mental podcast. Do you have any final words, and where can somebody get you if they want to get hold of you and pick your wonderful brain about imagery?
Yeah, so thanks a million for having me on. First of all, it's always a very enjoyable conversation. So that's great. I'm going to give Pete my address where you can send my honorary doctorate in the book. And hopefully the next time I come on, I'll have an actual doctorate and not an honorary doctorate. So if people are looking to get me, they can get me at Owen McNeil on Twitter.
Yeah, we'll put a link to that information in the description for the show as well. So thank you so much, Owen, for joining us on 80% Mental. And I hope that you put your honorary 80% Mental doctorate on your CV as well as your actual doctorate when you get it.
Absolutely. In the pride of place.
Can I also point out, Pete, that you asked me to have better bants at the start, and I did manage to make a reference to Rogers and include a line from a Kenny Rogers song, and hoping I was like throwing a curveball, but nobody picked that up.
Well, maybe some of the listeners picked it up. I didn't.
I definitely did.
Right, so
it's not really what I meant by better chat. Hugh, it's not what I had in mind. Throwing in obscure Kenny Rogers references in the middle of sentences about imagery.
Right. Okay. I'm going to have to go and work harder then. Thanks, Pete.
So on this episode, we started off by asking, is what you see really what you get? And we've explored what imagery actually is, how using the mind to imagine and rehearse skills and performances can be really beneficial for athletes. And I suppose for anyone really, in any number of different scenarios. We've explored some of the different theories as to how it works, and we've heard some practical suggestions for how we might best do imagery, again, from an athlete's point of view and a psych's point of view. And, I hope that it's been really useful for everyone listening. As usual, we'd love it if you subscribed to the podcast, wherever it is that you get your podcasts from. And a rate and review on Apple would be great too, and would really help other people to find us. So don't forget, all of our episodes are available at www.80percentmental.com, which is all words, and you can tweet us at EPM Podcast. We'd love to hear from you, and we will see you next time. Well, we won't see you because it's a podcast.